You are listening to She Rebel Radio. I'm Lulu Minns.
And I'm Mary Lobo. Today we're talking about self-sacrifice to self-care, and you can download Lulu's free toolkit that goes along with this series.
But before we dive in, let me properly introduce you to Mary Lobo, my co-host for the next 16 weeks. And if we like her, maybe we'll let her stay. Now, how did we meet Mary? Because it was at an event that had a little self-care involved, from what I remember, because it was a good few years ago now.
Yes, I believe it was 2017, and it was an event hosted by two lovely ladies who were starting a business called Feed, which involved organizing like food events, sharing around food, but also teaching people about food and nutrition at the same time. And they were launching the business, and they wanted to get a group of ladies together to try their food and also to have this sort of sharing experience. And I sat next to you at the table. It was outside, it was gorgeous, wasn't it, in Brighton?
Yeah.
And we started talking, and we were telling each other about our respective jobs and what we did. And you said you were starting a podcast, and I said, oh, you need me on your podcast. You said it was about female leadership, and I told you that I had a skincare business and I was an entrepreneur, and I was like, get me on your podcast, and you were like, okay. And that's sort of how we became friends.
We did, yeah, and we've really developed our relationship and friendship since that time. And I quite often say no to people when they ask to be on the podcast, but you were a definite yes. And I remember having a conversation with you about this not that long ago, and you were like, did I actually say that? And I was like,
Yeah.
100%. And I think it was 2019, because that's when I launched the podcast in September.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
2019. And I think
Yeah, I feel like I've known you for years.
I know. We've always said it feels like we were at uni together or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, it probably was the summer, it being a nice day, that I was, launching with 10 episodes, and I was
Was.
exploring what they were going to be.
It was the summer, and I think I was your first,
Yeah.
wasn't I? I was your first episode.
Yeah. Well,
People can go and listen to
I
that one.
know. Very first guest. I think the very first
Oh,
episode
yeah.
was Why She Rebel Radio, and then you were my first guest. So
Right.
yeah, it's a full circle
Mm.
moment of you coming back
Yeah.
to co-host.
Yes. And wow, yeah, I mean, for me, this is just an extension of our friendship because we love to sit down and chat, don't
We
we?
do. We can chat for hours. We definitely can. And to put a little bit of context as to this 16-part series, I wrote an ebook 7 years ago called Shadow to Self. And, we're heading into the darker half of the year. So I thought it would be a really good time to share those principles with you on this podcast. And you can download the free toolkit. And as the 7-year personal growth cycle goes, I'm always talking about that. I'm teaching women about that. I've got a new book coming out in 2025, which is very exciting, all about that very subject. So it was really helpful to me to go back to the content that I created 7 years ago. Mary is copy editing the new book, and we thought it would be great to
Yeah.
celebrate that original piece of work and have the toolkit as a free download, didn't we?
Yes. And I think this is just a great opportunity for people to have more access to your content. But I think this is going to lead us into the book, which is absolutely fabulous. I don't want to talk too much about the book here because it's something completely separate. But I think this is a great introduction to what is to come.
Yeah, and injecting, She Rebel Radio has been going for over 5 years now, a bit of new energy. And those of you that have listened and supported the podcast throughout know I have lots of amazing female leaders and entrepreneurs on that I'm interviewing. And then I've done a big number of solo shows as well. But this is a real conversation to kind of pull out and unpack those principles from my
Yeah.
perspective, from your perspective too.
Yes. And I also think it's really interesting because, I mean, as we've said, I've known you a long time, and we spend a lot of our time I've known you as a coach and a friend, and a collaborator. And in throughout our relationship, we always discuss things. We always talk about our experiences. And I just think this is really nice as a listener that you're hearing it from both sides, because I assimilate a lot of your teachings, just by nature, because that's the kind of person I am. I'm really into all this sort of self-reflection and trying to be the best version of myself. Also, as a female entrepreneur, I've had to fight really hard just to exist in the space, with lots of things against me, as we've spoken about, in you know, as a woman trying to carve out a business and do all the other things that I have to do to keep my life functioning. And over the years, you know, you've really supported me in that. I've had lots of sessions with you, and I just think it's interesting also as a listener to hear about how lots of your teachings and learnings, how they're assimilated on a personal level, which you're going to hear from me.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And yeah, I think you've said before how they've been received by you. And we're going to give you that really balanced view of created by me, received by Mary, but also, you know, Mary's a mum, I'm not. So you're going to get a really balanced perspective, you know, from us both as to how these principles actually apply day to day and, you know, what they actually mean for you personally. And then you can work through them with the toolkit and always share the takeaways with us on socials and all of that jazz. So do you know what's weird though, Mary, is I started the chapter Self-Sacrifice to Self-Care with a quote that is, self-sacrifice is one of women's 7 deadly sins. And that is a quote by Sarah, I probably could pronounce her name wrong, Ban Brannock. It's spelled Breathnatch, is what I was going to say, but I looked it up this morning to pronounce it correctly. And what I found really interesting with that, and yes, we're not talking about the new book in too much detail yet, is that 7, it's got the number 7 in it, which is a significant number in the next book, as it really appears in religious texts, art and nature, as well as our personal growth cycles. So it's so interesting that, you know, first chapter, I'm starting with the number 7 and, you know, writing in so much detail about it this year. But what do you think of that quote, Mary? Why is self-sacrifice one of a woman's 7 deadly sins?
Well, I think that really resonates with myself because I am a single parent. I'm always careful about saying single parent because my daughter's dad is around and does play a role, but primarily I'm the primary carer. And so I look after my daughter, you know, on my own during the week. And I'm also working and I'm doing all the things. I'm running a household. I'm trying to, you know, as a woman, we live in community. So not only do we support our households, we support our friends, we support our extended families. If we've got aging parents, we're looking after them. We've got very caring roles. And so I think the way I'm interpreting that is when we say self-sacrifice is one of women's 7 deadly sins, is because we constantly are giving over to others. We're constantly putting others above ourselves. And that can be detrimental to us in the long run. And as a parent, that's something you have to do. Your child always has to come before yourself because that is your role as a parent. But that can extend beyond that. That can go into, you know, you put your partner above yourself, you put maybe your boss, your colleague, your friend. We're doing it constantly with everybody. And it's so depleting.
Yeah.
And so that's how I interpret that, that we have to be really careful not to give too much of ourselves away because we leave nothing for ourselves.
Yeah, and over a period of time, it really is detrimental. And it's obviously, you know, one of the biggest things that when clients start working with me that we need to readjust. And often I show them like an upside down triangle with them at the bottom and all the weight of everything on top and what that looks like if we actually turn it up and the point of the triangle is where it should be and you're on the top and then all the things come underneath. And I think one of the reasons that it really is a deadly sin is also, and I'm not putting all women into this bracket, but we tend to multitask as well. So
Yeah.
when we are self-sacrificing, we're not, you know, and it's kind of the connotation of self-sacrifice can be really tied in with the hero's journey instead of the heroine's journey. You know, he'll lay down his cloak and his sword and, you know, self-sacrifice. And Kevin Costner in Robin Hood, Prince Thieves, one of my favorite films, if he'd die for her, you know, he'd really self-sacrifice. But the trouble is for women or anyone who multitasks is that you will self-sacrifice for 10 things at once instead of that one kind of life-changing thing that you need to, you know, push forward with. So instead of single mind focus, we have that multitasking across multiple people and their needs, which is why over a period of time, self-sacrifice can be so detrimental.
Yes, and we've got a higher propensity for guilt, which has been proven, you know, through various studies, female versus the masculine, is that men don't have the same feelings of guilt or guilt proneness that we have, and thus we feel terribly guilty if we can't be all the things to all the people and be great. We want to be great at our jobs, great partners, great parents, great friends. We want to be so good to people. And by doing so, we diminish ourselves. Men don't have that same life experience because they don't have the same level of guilt proneness. They biologically don't feel it in the same way as us. So that is often what is a big problem for us, is that even when we do put ourselves first, we feel terribly guilty about it and it doesn't sit right with us.
Yeah, so that really ties in with when we're saying no instead of yes, and we stop that default of saying yes and self-sacrifice. We sit with the guilt, which is, yeah,
Mm,
biologically, but also, socially, we are conditioned to be
mm,
more caring, to nurture our relationships, and to get some of our self-worth by what those our relationship to other people and what it is that we do for them and how it is that they need us. So there's all of that to take into account as well in terms of how we're socialized from very young women to be caring and to be nurturing and to be supportive, and men are conditioned in a very different way that that's not their priority. It goes below, their success and what there is they're going to achieve and all of that kind of stuff. Have you got
mm.
any examples of anything specific about how you self-sacrifice? I mean, I'm pretty selfish these days. So
I mean, yeah, I would say on a daily basis. Um, well, child rearing aside, because as I said, that for me doesn't in any way, that is a role I decided to take on, and I'm more than happy to have that role. But I definitely think, yeah, on a daily basis, I would say that I constantly take on things that I shouldn't take on. Uh, I would say because I'm quite high functioning, people ask me to do things that they could do, and I just take it on for them because I think it would be easier. But when if I unpack that, it's not easier for me. It's certainly easier for them. I don't think that people mean it, but if you're always someone who's goes, oh, look, I'll do it because it's easier or quicker, or it's less hassle if I do it.
yeah,
If you keep putting yourself in that position, then as I said, you just weigh, like you said, it's the upside down triangle. You're constantly weighing, putting more and more things on your shoulder. And obviously there's also resentment that builds into that, because you then start to think, oh, well, why can't they do it? Why am I always why am I always the one who has to do it? But then you've set yourself up in that role. I'm doing it all the time.
and I think
I just think,
within that, there is
yes,
responsibility on us as women, as business women, as women in leadership to bear in mind what we are putting on other women, including in friendships. We might be having an emotional meltdown, and yes, you want support from that friend that you rely on, but considering what else she has going on, because I see that lacking sometimes, when you're used to that person that you can rely on. We have to take into account, whether those people have children or positions of leadership or, business. And yes, we want to be there for our friends, but I think it's important how we can take a little bit of pressure off one another as well.
yes. And just going back to what you were saying earlier about, well, what we were saying about guilt, like I have a real problem with being able to sit with that uncomfortable feeling. Like if I say no to somebody, I feel really bad. I feel my instant response is, how has that made them feel? What do they think of me now that I've said no? Like, is it now changed how they feel about me? And that is just ridiculous. Like, if someone is your friend, you should be able to say to them, oh, I can't do that. And they'd be okay with that. And if they had any other reaction, then that's probably not someone you want to have as your friend. But I just know that personally, that I find it very uncomfortable to experience guilt, and then to sit with it, it just doesn't feel right to me. So that's something
Mm,
that, I mean, we've spoken about, that I've asked you for help with, that I need support in that, because saying no is a very alien concept to me. And even when I've done it, I don't like it. So it's not something
yeah.
that I I do willingly. Like, I mean, we've had conversations, haven't we, where you've said you need to say no to that person, and I've gone, okay. but it really
Yeah, and you've seen me
in
setting
different.
boundaries with people, and you're like, "Oh my God, girl, like, where did that come
Yeah,
from?"
yeah,
But you actually did it,
yeah,
I'll do it in jest, and I might use their full name, and otherwise I usually wouldn't. But, there's kind of a
yeah.
line, and yeah, we haven't dived deep with that. But one of the important things about that is to sit with it, is to sit with that guilt, the emotion. It takes, I'm going to use the number 7 again, 7 seconds for an emotion, which is energy and motion, to pass through. But so often we distract ourselves instead of sitting with that uncomfortableness. But I'm just going to move
Mm,
on a minute and just talk about very briefly Sarah Ban Brannock, who created that quote. I'm going to finish the quote
mm,
off in a minute because she added some additional things to it, which is quite interesting. But she wrote that quote, and she's a best-selling author in the New York Times. For a book that is simply, it's called Simply Abundance. I don't know if that applies particularly to women, but the quote itself came before that, I believe, in 1998, which is called Something More, and about women living authentically and more to their authentic self. And it was really interesting doing a bit more research about her. I've not read the book, so I do apologize to people for that. But she was writing about this in 1998, before it was really kind of a big narrative about women and how we could do things
mm.
differently and what we could do differently. And she's still going, because she did a women's summit in 2024 or something like that. She's American. Apologies to anyone American, and we're redoing some front covers and stuff, but the front covers are pretty terrible of the books, I have to say. But I've not read the books. But within that quote, Mary, she says as well, self-sacrifice being one of women's 7 deadly sins, along with, and this is harsh, ladies, so a bit of a trigger warning, self-abuse, self-loathing, self-deception, self-pity, self-serving, and self-immolation, which I had to look up the last one because I didn't actually know what that meant, which means to set.
That's setting fire to yourself,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it's setting yourself on fire.
Yeah.
Now, is that a bit harsh?
No, I don't think so, because when you were reading those out, I was going, yeah, yeah, yeah. But like, if I was going to go through each one individually, um, self-abuse, I would say, is, you know, putting yourself last, not looking after yourself. Meant some of the things that I do, like, forgetting to eat, or not sleeping because I'm, doing things for other people and I'm staying up really late. So that's how I would interpret self-abuse. Self-loathing, I've done that a lot. Um, attacking myself for all the things I don't do and I should have done, and how things should have been different. I should have played things differently when I was younger, or
The
whatever.
mental narrative.
Self-deception. Yeah, the mental narrative, definitely. Self-deception, I would say, not, being blind to some of my, my failings or whatever. But we've spoken about that as well in the past. It's like, shining a light on stuff you don't really want to look at. Self-pity, I've done that as well. Like, why me? Why me? Like, other people, all my friends who got married and have had these, 2.4 families, like, why me? Why wasn't that my story? Self-serving, I guess. Self-serving, would that be taking advantage of situations for your own benefit? Would that
Yeah.
be how you would interpret?
I don't know. Or does that self-pity and victim mode that we all find
Mm.
ourselves in, like, serve us to stay where we are?
Oh, that's a good one. Maybe, possibly, yeah. Because our stories allow us not to have to face, the self-deception. And then self-immolation, the setting fire to oneself. I can identify with that as well. The um self-sabotage, right?
Mm,
I
hmm.
guess. Um uh I'm just trying to think. Self-immolation. Would that be like setting fire to your life? Is that how you'd interpret
Yeah.
that? I don't know. More self-sabotage.
Or maybe there's elements of that we, do that because women, we have more, clear rites of passage as women, and chapters within our life, menopause being one, motherhood being another. My mum always said, although I blame her for not settling down, don't settle down till you're in your 30s because women change, and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm telling clients to burn shit all the time, like not their possessions or anything, but
Yeah.
like old narratives, and stuff like that. And it's the phoenix can come out of the ashes. So maybe it's not as harsh as it sounds, but
Actually saying it's one of our 7 deadly
mm,
sins. So when she's talking, because I would agree that like sometimes setting five, changing things up is a really positive thing, but she obviously doesn't mean it in this
no.
context because she's saying it's one of our deadly sins. So self-immolation, maybe it means like, because fire's consuming, perhaps it means like, we let our lives consume us to the point of we give up our real identity,
Yeah.
potentially. I don't know. I'd like to interview her and ask her
Mhm.
what she means by that one.
Yeah.
Can we find out?
Yeah. Maybe we'll get onto She Rebel Radio.
Let's write to
Yeah.
her and find out.
I know. Well, I know my great aunt, who's 91 and amazing, she had written a letter when my grandmother died, and my grandfather had, an awful accident when he was only in his late 30s and never fully recovered. And she wrote a letter to my mum and her siblings about my grandmother, that she, after his accident, never found her identity as a woman who was not the companion of him, because they actually had a great life. They traveled, they had 3 kids, and from what I can read from their old letters, were very much in love and had a real adventure that was very different, I think, for the 1950s. But I thought that was really interesting that, yeah, she didn't find her identity outside of those relationships
Mm.
that she had. So that kind of ties in.
It's so common, isn't
Yeah,
it? Let's face
yeah,
it, women, it's so common. If you don't find you, sometimes we don't find our identity out of, our romantic relationships, but also out of our relationships with our children. So much, that's why women have, yeah, empty nest syndrome and stuff like that, because they really suffer that once once a relationship is removed or changed, they it's very hard to then find like, who are you? Because your identity has been so much of that relationship.
yeah, yeah. So let's move and talk about self-care, um, which Audre Lorde, in her, I'm going back to like the old school 80s, 90s, in her book 1988, A Burst of Light, which was written soon after she was diagnosed with cancer for the second time. Now, she was an activist, a socialist, a feminist, a Black woman, a lesbian. She had the intersection of diversity, going on at a really difficult time where women like her were not used to having their voices heard. And she talked about caring for herself, not being self-indulgence. It's
Mm,
self-preservation and an act of political warfare, and asks us to
mm.
remember that every act of self-care is radical and it's resistance, which are really powerful words again. What do you kind of make of that?
Yeah, again, I can identify with that. I think for me, like I said, so much of it is tied up in guilt. So therefore, to sort of throw that back, to just go, like you said, I didn't know, it's very interesting what you said about 7 seconds. It takes 7 seconds for an emotion to sort of pass. So I'll use that now. But yes, to sit with that uncomfortable feeling and not try to change it, for me, is a radical thing to do.
Mm.
Yeah. And it was also like an act of warfare, almost like against myself, because it's like, no, don't do anything. Don't do the instinctive thing, which is to say, oh, look, it's okay, I'll do it anyway. Or, don't worry, I'll make it work. Or, to bend over all the time, um, to try and capitulate to everybody else. That for me is a form of radical self-care.
Yeah.
So I can identify with what she's saying. And I guess that when you do have an illness, a disease, something that it forces you, because it's not being selfish anymore, is it?
No, no. And, a disease, as, we say in yoga and things like that, is not being at ease. And a second diagnosis, I think it was her second diagnosis of cancer. And Lord, having that intersection of diversity, as a Black woman, as a lesbian woman, for her, she was really, in 1988, putting it out there saying, I matter. hold on a minute, I don't have to come, at the bottom of the scrap heap, which is what
Mm,
society's telling me. I can take care of myself. And that, is an act of political warfare against society. And it also is, with herself and perhaps conditioning and growing up and all of that kind of stuff. So
mm,
where do you think, though, self-care is so, I used to, in my old Facebook group many moons ago, we'd have self-care Sundays and things like that. And it's become really mainstream narrative now of, a bubble bath and yoga and all the things. But
mm. I
I
hate that.
know, where does it become a little bit toxic?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had this conversation before. I really hate because when I've had difficult time, challenging times, and people have said to me, "Oh, you need to like take 5 minutes to meditate, or you need to have a bubble bath," like we've said, I find that really unhelpful advice, also highly patronizing. As if like a bubble bath is going to, make any kind of difference to the immediate situation. But I think, in referencing this particular quote, that actually just saying no, as an example, not making yourself available all the time, not being the go-to person for everybody, not maybe always being the person, the shoulder to cry on for everybody, as you mentioned earlier. That is for me what self-care is. For me, having a bubble bath or going for a walk or meditating isn't self-care for me because it doesn't do enough. We're actually saying no, keeping my boundaries, pushing back on things is far more self-preservation for me. I would get a lot more from that than I would for a 30-minute bubble bath.
Yeah. Although, I'm back in Brighton.
I'm not saying that those things aren't nice, by the
No,
way.
no, no, I totally agree. But I think we can use the self-preservation almost like a lens to deepen that commitment to ourselves in terms of self-care. And I was going to make a joke about I don't have a bath in my flat or in my place in Cornwall. And I'm like, my feet are suffering. They're not as soft as they once were. So if I invite myself to your house to have a bath, that is an act of political warfare and self-preservation. Because I was like, it's all the rage to not have a bath now for climate reasons and things like that. But I am missing it somewhat. But if we can use that as a lens to really create more boundaries around our self-care and go, actually, is it as a radical self-care enough? And also, again, this responsibility we have as women not to, and I find, and I know, and we'll probably have this conversation later on down the series, but also menopause being talked about, that's amazing. But then women can put other women in that bracket before they're there. So we're having the conversation, but then we're massively pissing each other off at certain
Mm.
times, and we have to take responsibility about when someone's not in a good place. Don't tell them to get a bloody bubble bath. You know.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I just find that it minimizes experience by saying something like, if someone's going through something traumatic or someone is overloaded, or like you said, we're going through the menopause and everything's changing, our bodies are changing. We feel almost like our bodies are against us in some ways. To be told by a fellow female, oh, you just need, you need to just put your feet up for 5 minutes and take a break. It's sort of minimizing the extent of what we're experiencing, and that actually is worse coming from a female because we really need to support each other. But I think when you hear it from a female, it's like a knife in the back, because you'd expect a man to say something like that because they have no lived experience of what we go
we
through. But you certainly wouldn't expect it from a
No,
friend.
you sounded a bit like a man when you said it, actually. God love them. But it's a bit like red rag to a bull, isn't it? Is not
Yeah.
understanding. And one of the big things that's really interesting that I talk about a lot in that chapter is honoring our cycles and our seasons. And that being a massive act of self-preservation, being, menopause is a change within our seasons. We have it through the 12-month cycle, and also within our 7-year personal growth cycles. But as I said, that is not what this series is about. That's coming next year. But I found it so interesting, which is why it's so important that we go back to things that we were doing 7 years ago. And I was like, oh my god, I was writing about this 7 years ago, and that work has a new layer of wisdom, growth and maturity to it. But it's been a real way of self-preservation for me, of understanding. And I had a slight medical issue earlier this year, and something with my hormones. and which is not on the menopausal scale, it's a different thing. But friends of mine were like, oh well, yeah, you always say you're hormonal, and I'm like, yeah, not it, I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean, I'm sitting on the sofa eating chocolate and not coming out to your party. um I'm hormonal, and I take less calls because I've been honoring my seasons and my cycles for a number of years now, and that's a way that when I'm in my good energy I can really bring more energy. So that's but that takes commitment and time to
Mm.
kind of tune in with that. But more on that next year. And anything you want to share, Mary, before we go?
I just think that this really resonates with me, this particular topic, because I think a lot of women, I think, would probably say the same. We've all got different lives, different responsibilities. But for the friends that I have that don't have children, they have much more complex jobs. I mean, we've all got complex jobs, but they take on so much with their work um, and as well with their social engagements. They're out all the time. It doesn't really matter what, I think, experience you have as a woman, as in what your life looks like. It's always overloaded, whether you've
Yeah.
got a child, or whether you've got a corporate position, or whether you've got a partner, or even if you don't have a partner, it's overloaded, trying to find a partner. I just think that every single woman can identify with being completely overloaded and taking on too much.
Mm.
And we all have our capacities different for all of us. So I think that, pushing back on that is what we're talking about with the self-care. It goes beyond, just looking after the way we feel, but actually protecting our energy levels. I don't know if you can identify
Yeah,
that
no,
with that as well.
definitely. And I think it's really important that I think what's come up is that compassion for one another. As you said, whether you've got these things, whether you haven't, aging parents, we mentioned right at the beginning, something that I've experienced. And, not we talk about judgment much later on. I don't have children, etc. And I've had women say to me, oh, it's easier for you. And I'm like, you don't know the mental anguish that women go through that don't have children. You don't know whether it's a choice or not a choice, so it's really that compassion for each other wherever we're at. But before you go, remember you can download the free toolkit that goes along with this series. And we're going to share with you 2 journaling tools for this week. Mary, do you want to share yours first?
Yes, this week I will be the woman who lets go of self-sacrifice. I will do this by allowing others to help me. When someone is kind enough to offer to assist me in something, rather than saying, no, it's fine, don't worry, because I don't want to overburden someone else, I'm actually going to relinquish that bit of control and say, do you know what? That's really kind of you, and I could really do with some help.
Amazing. So, yeah, that's a good shift. It sounds like you don't usually say yes to that.
No, I never do. But I think that sometimes you need to, just to allow yourself to be open to receiving, because quite often we say, don't we? Like, I always have to do this on my own. No one helps me. And again, it's what we're talking about, getting into that victim mentality, when actually there probably are lots of people that would help you if you allowed them to.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. I like it. I like it. So I'm going to share mine, which is this week, I will be the woman who chooses self-care. I will do this by not overcommitting myself elsewhere in my diary, because this is my hormonal week and I have a big event in London where I've got to be super sociable and dressed up, and I'm really looking forward to it. But already I'm kind of like, London's quite a lot when I'm in my hormonal week, and by that I mean I'm due on my period. So I need to really turn on the self-care around that and not overcommit myself, so by the time that event comes around, that I'm totally exhausted and flat and don't want to go.
So you mean, obviously you're going to go to that event, but anything either side of that, or maybe in a couple of days leading up to it, you're going to pull back and not overcommit to anything else?
Yeah, and that's like including my yoga and things like that. I just need to,
Mm.
spend a bit more time at home, so I'm more up for that event than I would in other times of the month.
And I think that's a really good thing to reflect on, because, we've spoken about self-care being all the bubble baths and the yoga and the meditation. What you're actually saying is not overdoing it. So not doing the yoga, because actually that is an act of self-care, of not always having to be doing things.
Yeah, not always being on because you're rushing around doing this, going to yoga. It's noticing when
Yeah.
that's actually detrimental.
Yeah, that's good.
Amazing. I've loved doing this episode with you. Thank you to our listeners. You've been listening to She Rebel Radio with me, Lulu Mins.
And me, Mary Lobo. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left us a review.
And perhaps you could share this episode with another amazing woman.